If you've been studying ultrasound physics and still feel like axial and lateral resolution just aren't making sense, you are not alone. A lot of students try to memorize the type of resolutions, and that's exactly why it gets confusing. So I'm going to break it down in a way that actually makes sense. And just so you know, this is a lesson pulled directly from my full ultrasound physics course. I'm just uploading it here so you can get a real preview of how I teach before deciding if the course is for you. So let's dive in. If you think about it, as sonographers, we're kind of like photographers, but instead of using light, we use sound. Our transducer is the camera. We aim it, it sends energy out, and then it captures reflections to build an image. Every good photographer knows that their picture depends on focus and clarity, being able to see each tiny detail sharply. Ultrasound works exactly the same way. So let me break this down for you. Think about your phone camera. Everyone wants the phone with the best quality, the one with the higher resolution. Imagine taking a picture of two coffee cups sitting next to each other. On a low resolution camera, those cups might blur into one, but on a high resolution camera, you can clearly see two separate cups side by side, distinct, sharp, and accurate. That's what resolution is really about. And in ultrasound, we need that same kind of clarity. If our echoes are close together, but our system can't tell them apart, then what you see on your image will be inaccurate. So, resolution is what allows our ultrasound camera to tell two separate things apart. Now, in your 2D ultrasound image, those details line up in two directions: front to back, which is along the sound beam, that's known as axial resolution, and then left to right, which is across the sound beam, that's lateral resolution. An easy way to remember it is A for axial and A for along the beam. This is talking more about depth. L for lateral and L for left to right. This is talking more about width. Now let's talk about axial resolution. Axial resolution tells us how close two reflectors can be front to back along the sound beam and still show up as two separate echoes instead of one. If the echoes overlap, your image will lose clarity and the machine will just see one bigger echo. So let's make this make sense. Think about my lessons right now. I like to keep them shorter, not because I want to rush you, but because I know if I talk for too long, all of that information starts to blend together. Like, just be honest. What happens when you're in a long lecture in school? You start zoning out, and it becomes one long stream of words where you can't tell where one thing ends and the next begins. But when I keep it short and clear, you can easily separate each point, follow along, and actually understand it. It's the exact same thing in ultrasound. If our system sends out one long pulse, by the time the echoes come back, everything's mushed together. But a short pulse sends clear bursts, meaning that each echo comes back separately and cleanly. That's why shorter pulses always give you better image detail. This all ties back to something we've talked about before: spatial pulse length, or SPL. If you remember, SPL is just how long that sound pulse actually is from start to finish. It depends on two things: how many cycles are in that pulse and the wavelength of each cycle. So, more cycles or longer wavelengths equals a longer SPL, and fewer cycles or shorter wavelengths equals a shorter SPL. And we always want a shorter SPL because shorter pulses give cleaner, separate echoes. So now that the story of pulse length makes sense, here's how we measure it. Axial resolution is equal to SPL divided by 2. We divide by 2 because the pulse has to travel to the reflector and back again. And here's the part that matters. The smaller the value of axial resolution, the better it is. So we want to keep SPL short because a short SPL equals a smaller axial resolution value, which equals a sharper image. And here's how I always remember this formula. Think of axial like an axe. You can picture an axe literally chopping that SPL in half. That's what the formula says. SPL divided by 2. Now, in soft tissue, there's another way to write this formula that helps it click even more. Axial resolution is equal to 0.77 multiplied by the number of cycles in the pulse divided by frequency. Let's go back to the basics. Remember, the numerator, which is the top part of a fraction, moves in the same direction as the result. In this case, the number of cycles in the pulse is in the numerator. So the more cycles we have, the bigger the value of axial resolution. But remember, we don't want big numbers. We want lower numbers, which means to get a lower axial resolution value, we would need less cycles in the pulse. That means that shorter pulses, which are fewer cycles, give a better axial resolution. Now let's go to the denominator. Remember, the denominator, which is the bottom part of a fraction, moves in the opposite direction of the result. In this case, the bottom part, which is frequency, sits in the denominator. So if frequency increases, the overall value of axial resolution decreases, making your resolution smaller and sharper. That's why we always say higher frequency gives better detail. This is all baked right into the math. Now, if you see this show up on a test or your SPI exam, they might not actually say axial resolution. They could use one of its synonyms instead. So here's your simple reminder. LARD, or LARRD, those stand for longitudinal, axial, range, radial, and depth resolution. So if you see any of those words, it's the same concept. They are all referring to axial resolution. So to wrap that up, axial works along the beam, which is front to back. It depends on pulse length. Short is better. A smaller number means better resolution, and it is improved by higher frequency and fewer cycles in the pulse. Now we're going to spin our view sideways. Remember in our sound beam lesson when I said that a narrow beam gives the best image detail? We're bringing that back right here. Lateral resolution is how well we can separate two structures that are sitting next to each other, side by side. So let's think back to your phone for a second. When you tap the screen to focus on something, the picture instantly sharpens, right? What's actually happening is your camera is narrowing its focus around that subject, blocking out other areas. But when it's out of focus, that means the camera's opening is wide, so light is spreading out and things that are close together start to blur. The same thing happens in ultrasound. Think of your transducer like a camera. When your sound beam is too wide, it covers more area and multiple echoes blend together. But when your beam is narrow, it focuses tightly, meaning it can hit one structure at a time and your image looks crisp. So here's the key. Lateral resolution is determined entirely by the width of your sound beam. So a narrow beam equals better lateral resolution, while a wide beam gives us worse lateral resolution. So take a look here. When the beam is wide, that means more structures that are side to side are being squeezed together inside that same beam. The system can't easily tell them apart, so those details might blur into one. But at the focus, Where the beam is the narrowest and the most concentrated, the system can easily separate those echoes. That's why lateral resolution is best at the focus, because the beam is most narrow there. The formula for lateral resolution is nice and simple. Lateral resolution equals beam width. When the beam width is smaller, then the lateral resolution value is also smaller. And remember, a lower value is what gives us better resolution. Lateral resolution also has its own list of synonyms. Think of it like LATA. So that literally stands for lateral, angular, transverse, or azimuthal. So if you see any of those terms, it's all talking about the same concept, lateral resolution. Now remember, beam width is the main factor that controls lateral resolution. A narrower beam allows us to better separate structures that sit side by side. But let's connect this back to frequency for a second. Higher frequency beams tend to spread out less than lower frequency beams. In our sound beam lesson, we saw that higher frequency sound waves are more tightly packed and more controlled. And because of this, they spread out less and the beam stays narrower for a longer distance. And remember, a narrower beam improves lateral resolution. So, frequency actually has an impact on both axial and lateral resolution. However, the strongest and most direct relationship between frequency and resolution is with axial resolution. Higher frequency directly shortens wavelength, which shortens spatial pulse length, and that directly improves axial resolution. So just remember that frequency influences both, but its most powerful effect is on axial resolution. The SPI exam loves to test this concept, so just remember lateral resolution equals beam width. It is best at the focus because it is the narrowest part of the sound beam. And if there's a wider beam, that's going to be poorer lateral resolution. And from a practical scanning point, this is why we always place our little focus marker right at or just below the structure we care about. Doing that tells the machine, hey, I want to make the sound beam narrow right here so we can get the cleanest edges and clearest image detail possible. Okay, so now that we know why focusing matters, it's what gives us that clear, sharp image at the focus, let's talk about how we actually do it in ultrasound. There are three main ways we can focus a sound beam: external focusing, internal focusing, and electronic focusing. All three have the same goal: to squeeze that beam tighter and improve lateral resolution, but they go about it in different ways. Let's first start with external focusing. This one uses an acoustic lens that sits in front of the transducer crystal. It's kind of like glasses for your probe. That lens bends the sound waves inward so they start to converge sooner. This is known as a fixed focus, meaning once the probe is made, that focal depth is set. You can't adjust it while scanning. This type of focusing is mostly used in older transducers or transducers with one element, like a mechanical one. The next one is internal focusing. So this one doesn't use a lens, but instead the crystal itself is curved. That curvature makes the sound waves spread out differently. They start naturally converging toward each other as they travel. The more curved the crystal is, the more the beam focuses. So this method builds the focusing right into the design of the element. And just like external focusing, internal focusing is fixed, meaning you can't change it once it's built. It's decided when the transducer is manufactured. And finally, the coolest and most flexible one, electronic focusing. This is the kind used in all modern array transducers. Since these probes have multiple small elements, the system can adjust timing when each element fires to control how the sound waves line up and combine. By delaying some elements just a little, the system makes those sound waves meet up at a certain depth, and that's your focus. So, with electronic focusing, we can have multiple focal zones and we can drive our focus around as the sound beam sweeps through the image to give us better detail. So, here's the big takeaway: you are not just taking pictures. Everything you do as a sonographer has a physics meaning behind it, even if you don't realize it when you're scanning. Like when you're switching from a lower frequency abdominal probe to a high frequency linear one to scan the thyroid, and that image suddenly pops in quality, that's not magic. That's you using higher frequency sound, which creates shorter pulses, and that's what gives you better axial resolution. When you adjust your focal zone to sit right at the structure you're imaging, that's you telling the system, hey, narrow your beam right here. That's lateral resolution, giving you the best focus right where you need it. So every button you press, every adjustment you make connects back to the physics you've just learned. So now you understand the resolution that works front to back, that's axial, and you understand the resolution that works side to side, that's lateral. But our ultrasound image isn't flat. The beam also has thickness, and that can affect what we see from top to bottom in our imaging plane. So, in the next lesson, we're going to look at that third dimension called slice thickness and learn how that impacts your image clarity just like the others. Are you now realizing that you're not just operating a machine? You're controlling sound, energy, and focus on purpose. Understanding the physics behind what you do is what transforms you from someone who just scans to someone who truly knows what they're doing. That's the difference between simply pushing buttons and mastering your craft. All right, so now that you understand the difference between axial and lateral resolution, let's actually apply it. I'm going to walk you through one or two questions so you can see exactly how this shows up on tests and how I break it down step by step. All right, so let's break down question one. First thing I want you to do is look how the question is worded. It mentions which adjustment would improve the ability to separate structures along the path of the sound beam. And that phrase right there is your clue. Remember, along the beam, we're talking about axial resolution. A for axial, A for along. So now instead of looking at all of these answers randomly, your brain should automatically go, okay, what controls axial resolution? Always remember that axial resolution is controlled by what? The length of the pulse. And our pulse length is always affected by our frequency. We always want higher frequencies to give us shorter pulses to make sure that we could cleanly separate those two structures along the beam. So now that we know that, let's go through the options. So A says to increase the frequency. We like this option because remember I said higher frequency shortens the pulse, which improves axial resolution. But let's keep going. Now B says to adjust the focal zone to the area of interest. Don't get trapped here. Yes, focusing does help with resolution, but it helps with lateral resolution, meaning if you adjusted your focal zone, you would be fixing that ability to separate structures that are side by side, which is across the beam, not along the beam. So please don't get confused here. C says to increase the depth, but depth does not affect resolution in this way. And then D says to increase persistence, and persistence more so deals with smoothing and blending frames together, and this actually affects temporal resolution, not axial. So once you identify the concept, the wrong answers basically fall apart. So the final answer here is A, which is increase the frequency. All right, so for this one, it is saying, what is the primary factor that determines lateral resolution. So immediately don't get distracted by the answer choices just yet. Just pause and ask yourself, what is lateral resolution again? Remember, lateral, L for left or right, that's about side to side structures. So we're talking about the ability to separate structures that are next to each other across the beam, okay? So what controls that? Remember, it all comes down to the width of your sound beam. A narrower beam gives you better side to side detail. So now let's go through the options. Now, A says pulse duration. Remember, pulses are more associated with axial resolution, okay? So we can eliminate that. B says the beam width. Now, this matches exactly what we were thinking. But then C says PRF. This is simply not related here. And D says frequency. And the thing is, frequency does help resolution, but it more so helps axial resolution directly. It is not the main factor for lateral resolution. So you just want to make sure that you don't get tripped up or tricked by these different answer choices. Okay, so final answer here is going to be the beam width. All right, so hopefully now you can actually see the difference between axial and lateral resolution and also how those topics can show up in questions. Okay, so this is exactly how I teach inside my full ultrasound physics course. I just really try to break things down step by step so it actually makes sense to students. And then I help you to apply it so you know how to answer those questions with confidence. And again, this video is just a lesson preview so you can get a feel for how I teach. So if my teaching style works for you and you want the full breakdown of all of those important ultrasound physics concepts, you can feel free to check out my physics course using the link below. And if you are specifically working on passing the SPI exam and you want more help with question breakdowns like I did at the end of the video, I also have a crash course focused just on that. All right, so everything is linked below, and also this is my website here, so you can choose what works best for you. All right. So thank you so much for watching. If this video helped things to make sense for you, make sure to like it and subscribe to my channel.